Well, good evening, everybody. My name's Amanda Vickery. I'm a professor of history, but also I'm an occasional radio presenter, a presenter of Start the Week, and that's why I was asked to chair the discussion tonight. I'm delighted to be here because I'm a huge admirer of Lord Peter Hennessy. And as most of you know, the Mile End Institute was founded in 2015 under the patronage of Lord Hennessy to encourage the bringing together of academics, politicians, policymakers, and the public to explore the major challenges facing British politics, policy making, and public life. Tonight, in a momentous week for the planet, we're discussing Trump and the future of the special relationship. Is it so special anymore? So tonight, we're going to hear from Lord Darroch. Kim Darroch is one of Britain's most accomplished diplomats. Most recently and relevantly for tonight, he served as the British ambassador to the US from 2016 to 2019 during President Trump's first term in office. Evie Aspinall is the director of the British Foreign Policy Group, an independent, non-partisan think tank which explores the interaction between domestic and foreign policy in the 21st century. Dr James Ellison is a reader in international history at Queen Mary, University of London here, and he is an expert in Britain's relationships with Europe and the United States and the diplomacy of international alliances since 1945. So how this is going to go tonight is we're going to have a brief introduction by James, then we're going to hand over to Kim and then to Evie for some remarks. I'm going to pose some general questions to the panel, and then we're going to throw the discussion open to everybody in the room. Thank you very much for coming. So first, over to Dr. Ellison.
Very much, Amanda. Thank you to Kim and Evie for being with us, and to everybody here this evening for coming along. It's now over 80 years ago that Winston Churchill traveled across the Atlantic in the middle of the Second World War to deliver a speech to the American people about giving up on the relationship which he had brought into being and would soon call special. I think it's safe to say that if Winston Churchill was with us this evening, for different reasons, he would have cause to worry about the United States' commitment to what he called the special relationship. On Monday, the 6th of September, 1943, 3 days after British and Canadian troops had landed on the tip of Italy to begin the Allied invasion, and 3 days before American and British soldiers would do the same at Salerno on the beaches to begin the Allied invasion proper, Churchill stood in Harvard University to preside over a convocation ceremony and receive an honorary degree. 12,000 people stood and listened to him. He gave a soaring speech entitled The Gift of a Common Tongue. He spoke of ties of blood and history between the British Commonwealth and Empire and the United States of America. Law, language, literature, the conception of what is right and decent were the commonalities he saw on both sides of the ocean amongst the people he called the English-speaking peoples. Such poetry and rhetoric, so common to his speeches, were robes around Churchill's main point. That was to extol the virtues of the British and United States Combined Chiefs of Staff Committee, which you see behind me now. The apex of the military cooperation where two nations shared sovereignty in their national security in defense of their ways of life and also that of the free world. He called it a wonderful system that no two allies had enjoyed before in history. Yet the great Anglo-American himself, having wooed Roosevelt to conjure up the relationship he believed to be the only salvation in the face of the fascist war machine, had traveled to Harvard not just to celebrate this new wonderful system, but to warn about its loss. His trip across the Atlantic at risk of attack was largely to celebrate this new thing which he'd brought into being, but also at fear that the Americans might very shortly give up on it. In my opinion, he told the audience, it would be a most foolish and improvident act on the part of our two governments, on either of them, to break up this smooth-running and immensely powerful machinery the moment the war is over. For our own safety, as well as for the security of the rest of the world, we are bound to keep it working and in running order after the war. Here was Churchill, creator of the relationship, the future of which we are discussing this evening, 82 years later, doing what the US wartime correspondent in London, Edward R. Murrow, said he always did. In Murrow's introduction to the collection of Churchill's speeches in 1940, he wrote, "Now the hour had come for him to mobilize the English language, send it into battle, a spearhead of hope for Britain and the world." Churchill, of course, continued to do that in one of the speeches we remember him most for, which is when he gave it at the Fulton College at Westminster 3 years later. Here he is on the special train traveling from Washington with Harry S. Truman, the president, to Fulton. In that speech, he coined two phrases which ring down to our present day. The one that most of you here will probably remember referred to his declaration of the Cold War, which was darkening Eastern Europe at this time. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent of Europe. Yet that was his second message at Fulton. His first was the special relationship. Having spoken of the two great marauders, war and tyranny, he came to what he called the crux of what I've traveled here to say. He went on, "Neither the sure prevention of war nor the continuous rise of world organization will be gained without what I've called the fraternal association of the English-speaking peoples. This means a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and Empire and the United States." Tonight, we discuss the future of that relationship 2 days after the inauguration of a president who seems to be the first since the Second World War not to place unquestioning faith in the liberal world order that the United States and the United Kingdom and their allies built to keep the world safe through the Cold War and beyond. Donald Trump does, however, have faith in Winston Churchill. A bust of the former Prime Minister was sat in his White House during his presidency. In 2017, Trump declared himself, quote, "a big fan of the movie Darkest Hour," and screened it to members of Congress. When he stood for re-election in 2020, Donald Trump criticized the Democrats standing to defeat him for not being Winston Churchill. He also drew his 85 million Twitter followers to the publication of Nick Adams' book, Trump and Churchill, Defenders of the Western Civilization. He wrote in unusual understatement that it was a great honor to be compared in any way to Winston Churchill. Trump is yet the latest US president to admire the former British Prime Minister. The closest to him in terms of eloquence is Lyndon Baines Johnson, although I'm going to malign LBJ here in that comparison. Here you see LBJ accepting the bust of Winston Churchill in October 1965. Churchill had died earlier that year, and it was admitted to the White House permanent art collection from that point onwards. LBJ famously said about Churchill this, and this is close to Trump, but not as bad, "I'd be a slave today without the British and Churchill. I will not forget when Churchill came over here in 1941, barefoot, with his fly open, just before the clock struck 12. I admire the character of the British. It's difficult to beat them in the clinches." It's important for us this evening, as we consider the future of the relationship in a new era of uncertainty in world affairs, to remind ourselves of LBJ. It was during his presidency that a British Labour government took a decision to withdraw British men and materials from bases east of Suez, which materially changed the value of the United Kingdom as an ally of the United States. On the 5th of July 1968, in an unusual circumstance, the United States National Security Council held a meeting purely dedicated to the future of the Anglo-American relationship. In it, the Secretary of Defense, the man who you see on the left of the screen here, Clark Clifford, said that the British do not have the resources, the backup, or the hardware to deal with any one big world problem. They are no longer a powerful ally of the United States because they cannot afford the cost of an adequate defense effort. You could, in the mid-1960s, find many US government officials who began to doubt the future of the relationship that Winston Churchill had created. One of Clifford's colleagues, the diplomat and undersecretary in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, George Ball, was one of them. In the same year that Clifford proclaimed the US less of an ally, George Ball left office and published a memoir, The Discipline of Power. In it, he wrote a chapter which said that the special position that President John F. Kennedy had given to the United Kingdom in Europe sustained British delusions of grandeur. Yet even Ball had to admit that the Brits gave the Americans something unique. He wrote that generations of politicians and officials on both sides of the Atlantic had found that they look at each other and the world through the similarly refracted mental spectacles. As we debate the conditions in which we find the Anglo-American relationship in the changing world order this evening and the future of those relations, it is important to remember these historical precedents: Churchill's rhetoric, Trump's reflected glory, Clifford's hard measures of power, and Ball's mental spectacles. For in this combination from the past to the present, we have motifs and patterns which inform our debate this evening. We should put the concept of the special relationship under examination tonight, not least because it has been questioned by those involved in its safe passage since 1940. Famously, the US ambassador to the United Kingdom in the 1990s, Raymond Seitz, reminded President Bill Clinton on his arrival for a visit that he had to use the phrase special relationship. He saw the new president throw back his head, laugh, say special relationship mockingly. Clinton had been temporarily upset by the Major government for supporting his opponent in the 1992 presidential election. But that upset didn't last long, because he would find that he had a special relationship with a guitar player to match his saxophone in Tony Blair. Yet again in the 1990s, despite the asymmetry in power that was obvious by that point and in size, the United Kingdom and the United States, despite their very different national history since 1945, found that they had a relationship that was enduring. Historians have told us that three things explain the longevity of these relations despite the asymmetry in power: ideas, individuals, and events. They speak of a relationship born of the defense of democratic values, based on mutual strategic interest and extensive cooperation in international affairs. This has been a relationship of two capitalist democracies who have believed in international institutions, the rule of law, and liberal ideas of international association. They also tell us about close personal ties, unusually close, at the top of governments and societies. That characteristic began with Churchill and Roosevelt, but it was renewed under Macmillan and Kennedy, Reagan and Thatcher, Blair and Bush, and even perhaps Johnson and Trump. Although there was that moment when Trump famously said that I've always gotten along with Boris Johnson, but he's just gone a little bit too more liberal recently. Historians also tell us of a relationship forged through three global conflicts in defense of Western ideas and against common enemies: the Second World War, the Cold War, and the War on Terror. Talking of terror, we find ourselves this evening at the dawn of a new presidency. I am making no allusion here other than to what all practitioners and observers of international affairs dislike most in international relations: uncertainty. We are without doubt at a moment of intense uncertainty, perhaps more so than any other point since the end of the Cold War, and perhaps even since 1962. Ordinarily, as a professional historian, I find comfort in John Betjeman and his idea that when you understand the past, the confusion of the present becomes clearer. The confusion of our current moment puts even John Betjeman to test. President Trump distinguishes himself in many ways. As Lord Darroch has written in his memoirs, Collateral Damage, he is a mass of contradictions. Trump is, of course, the first US president since Woodrow Wilson to have British parentage. He's also the first US president ever to own a golf course in Scotland. But he's not the first president to want to make America great again. That was Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign slogan. But he is the first president to believe, apparently, that to place America first means to disrupt or disregard international rules, doubt international institutions to which the US has been committed, and deal overtly in transactional terms. These conditions suggest difficulty for an ally of the United States during the second Trump administration. We are very much in the unknown. Whether the characteristics of Trump's first presidency, when his rhetoric was sharper than his policy actions, will be repeated, we don't know. Whether the UK will be able to make itself important enough in the Trump universe, we don't know. On previous occasions, when the UK-US relationship has been strained, it has not broken. In 1956, at its lowest point since 1945 over the Suez Crisis, Churchill, aged 82, wrote to President Eisenhower, to save it. There is not much left for me to do in this world, he wrote, but I believe with unfaltering conviction that the theme of the Anglo-American relationship is more important today than at any point since the war. It's doubtful that those conditions still exist. It's possible that Trump's outlook and the changed nature of the United Kingdom post-Brexit and the circumstances of world politics today mean that there have been substantive changes which will affect the future of the Anglo-American relationship. But then again, as this poster shows, it's a promotional poster to try and recruit American soldiers to go to war in 1917-18. The United States has always needed allies, especially in the face of existential threats. And the UK has always needed an alliance, and with the United States in particular as its premier ally. When the flames are burning across the world, and when democracy is at question, and the liberal international order under fire, and Trump 2 days into his term of office, it's a necessary moment for us to consider the future of the special relationship with our two guest experts. Thank you very much.
So Kim, over to you. Delusions of grandeur or shared spectacles? It's on.
It's on. It's on. Thank you. And what I'm first going to say is not intended as a disagreement with that brilliant speech you just heard from James. It's just the way we diplomats tend to think. But we don't much like the term special relationship in the Foreign Office, just because most countries think that they have a special relationship of some form with the US, and it just sounds a bit needy for us to keep talking about it. Now, actually, it is special. The bedrock is the defense, intelligence, and security relationship, which is extraordinarily strong and which is mutually reinforcing. I mean, we do things that the Americans don't do at all because they rely on us, and we get an awful lot of stuff from them. So it's a bit lopsided, but it is hugely important to both of us. And then beyond that, you have massive cultural links, as you all know whenever you see how many British actors are starring in American films. Huge amount of people-to-people interaction, lots of tourism in both direction, and of course a huge amount of shared history, particularly in the 20th century through those two world wars. So it is special, but we diplomats tend to think the more you bang on about it, the less powerful it is. So don't invoke it too often. White House number 10 relations are not always special though. They have ups and downs. And if you want the ups, well, obviously everyone remembers Thatcher and Reagan. Less well known, but Harold Macmillan and J.F. Kennedy were very close, and Kennedy would consult Macmillan frequently by telephone, for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and treated him as a real advisor and as a sort of senior international statesman, which Harold Wilson was. And then it was obviously close during Blair and Clinton, and then Blair and Bush, despite the ideological difference between the two of them. But if you want some troughs, LBJ and Harold Wilson was not close, because LBJ never really forgave us for not sending even a token number of British troops to Vietnam. Nixon and Heath was never close, mostly because they were two of the most incompatible characters you could imagine. And Ted Heath was obsessed with getting Britain into the European Union, and Nixon had other things on his mind with Watergate. And then, as James said, Clinton and Major wasn't close because John Major rather unwisely gave a bit of assistance to George Bush in that failed election campaign that Clinton won. So it goes up and down. And so how's it going to be with Donald Trump? If I use the word challenging, you won't be surprised. It's maybe something of an understatement. I mean, on the one hand, Donald Trump is quite fond of the UK. As James said, he has a Scottish mother. She came from the Western Islands of Scotland, and he frequently talks about her. He owns 2 golf courses in Scotland. He was a big admirer of the royal family, particularly the late Queen. So he has quite warm feelings. He'd been to the UK quite often before his political career. And he hadn't been a lot around Europe, so in that sense we were quite privileged in how well he knew us. But, and it's a big but here, I don't think in Donald Trump's mind, being fond of a country and fond of its people translates into big policy concessions towards them. So in the first term, there wasn't, to be frank, much evidence of a specialness in our relationship with him compared to other countries. And when he came to, for example, to putting tariffs, 20% tariffs on all imports of steel and aluminium into the United States, we were not spared. The tariffs came in on us, no matter how much and how hard we lobbied, as well as the rest of Europe. I think the only country, for bizarre reasons, that actually escaped them was Australia. May have had something to do with Greg Norman, who was a big friend of Donald Trump on the golf course. I don't know. But anyway, the Australians, much to our collective envy, escaped the tariffs, but everyone else got nailed with them. And that included us. And as James also hinted at, there were quite a lot of critical tweets from Trump during that first term about various things, including particularly he disapproved of the way that Theresa May, Prime Minister for most of his first term, was handling Brexit, about which he was a huge enthusiast. So no favours in the first term and no evidence that the special relationship actually meant enough to him to make any big concessions, policy concessions to us. So how will it be in this term? Well, there's quite a lot in the Trump campaign rhetoric that should worry us. So quite a lot on which we would like to persuade him to change his mind. And let me take the first and most obvious point, which is his threat to levy 20% tariffs on the world, except for China, where the tariffs will be 60 to 100%. Are we going to be able to escape those? And the short answer is, I don't know. There are two reasons why we might. One is his main objection is to the EU, and particularly to Germany. He never got on with Angela Merkel, and he really objects to the huge trade surplus Germany runs with the US, and that's mostly goods, a lot of it's cars, but not just cars, machine tools, all sorts of things. And our trade is pretty much in balance, broadly, give or take, with the US, and an awful lot of it is services which tariffs probably wouldn't apply to. So that's one factor. And the other factor is, I think he might offer us a free trade deal. He did in his first term, and that might look quite attractive. It certainly looked attractive to the previous government and to Boris Johnson when he's in charge. But there's one big problem here, which is that his first demand, he believes American farmers vote for him, and he wants to give something back. And what he wants, if there's a free trade deal, is number one demand, free access, unrestricted, for all American agriculture. Two problems here. The one that everyone knows about is chlorine-washed chicken or hormone-treated beef, but the much bigger one is pretty much everything the Americans do in the agricultural field is way cheaper than ours, produced in much larger volumes, factory processes, and would undercut British farmers hugely. So if you were to accept that, the damage to the UK agricultural industry would be almost certainly massive. And that's why I agree, why I think the British government is unlikely, having already annoyed the farmers quite a lot, to go down that track. What you might get is a much more limited deal that covered, say, digital trade or financial services or something or other like that. But that is not going to do all the things to the British economy that some would claim a comprehensive free trade deal would do. Second thing, very quickly, because I mustn't overuse my time, what about Trump and NATO? He can't take America out of NATO without Senate approval, and he wouldn't get that. So I don't fear myself, I don't think that America's going to leave NATO, but he certainly believes, as he said publicly in his first term, NATO is a scam under which Europe gets America to pay for their defense while they spend all their money on social policies. And he, in the first term, was demanding everyone got to 2%. Actually, more than 20 countries in NATO are now at 2% of GDP. But now he's raised the bar to 5%, which, by the way, would be 2% more than America spends, which is somewhere between 3 and 3.5%. I don't think 5% is serious, but in terms of raising the bar like that, he's sending a signal that he's not going to lay off on all his arguments about European defense spending. So that, I think, is going to be problematic. And the trick, obviously, is to say to Donald Trump, it's down to you. I think it's as much down to the Ukraine war in reality, but it's down to you that most of Europe is now at 2%. And the first NATO summit you attend will be a victory lap for you, where we'll all tell the press that it's down to you, that we're all doing much more and much better. But honestly, I don't think he's going to buy that, and I think this is still going to be an issue. Very, very quickly, on Ukraine, I think it's critical, not just for the UK, but for all of Europe, that if a deal is done, and recently he's backed away, not surprisingly, from saying a deal will be done in 24 hours, and he's talking about 6 months or so, but it's critical that if a deal is done, it's a fair deal for Ukraine, which means, first, Ukraine shouldn't have to give away that chunk of eastern Ukraine to Russia, and second, that Ukraine should be able to decide its own future in terms of joining NATO and joining the EU. And personally, I don't see how Putin agrees to a deal on those lines, but we will see. And last point, obviously the Middle East counts for all of us. Actually, Trump played a positive role in getting that Gaza ceasefire deal over the line. But the really difficult stuff is, first of all, getting stage 2 and stage 3 of that deal done, and second, what about the long-term future and a durable peace between the Palestinians and Israel? And is he going to deliver on that? Is he going to put pressure on Netanyahu to do that? So, very quickly, I mean, this is an American first agenda. This is a guy who doesn't believe in the post-war international order. He doesn't really respect international law. He's not a fan of NATO. He's not a free trader. And it's all about every decision that's taken, every interaction with foreign countries must be to America's advantage, must live with the America First agenda, and that, I think, is a recipe for, as I say, a challenging bilateral relationship, some difficult times for the special relationship, and quite a lot of turbulence. So put your seatbelts on.
Personally. Evie, you run a non-partisan think tank devoted to foreign policy and domestic policy. What are your reflections?
Can you hear me at the back? Yes. A lot of what Kim basically just said, but less eloquently. So I will scramble. I've rewritten everything I've just said, so I'm not just repeating what he said. But I think we touched on at the start kind of the trajectory of the special relationship. And as we saw, it's been positive, it's been negative, it's kind of had its rocky periods, but it has endured. And I think my overarching kind of element of positivity to inject into the conversation is that I think the relationship will endure in the long term. I don't think the next 4 years will be good or be smooth for that on a bilateral or even a global level. But I think in the long term, UK-US relations will always have a long history that underpins them, that kind of shared culture, etc. Not least, that's essential because the United States is such a critical relationship for the UK. And while we may disagree, fundamentally, the UK isn't going to have much choice other than to suck it up and get on with Donald Trump for the next 4 years. And I also think for Donald Trump, while he's not going to be particularly extra nice, you also won't see some of the language that we've seen around the EU, for example, where today he was saying, the very, very bad EU. I don't think he's ever going to say that unless there's a big, blow up in relations at any point, that the UK is fundamentally very, very bad. He might say that Starmer is, he might say that the Labour Party is, but the UK as a whole, I think we have a bit of a steam in his mind, which is helpful. Secondly, then I wanted to touch on what I think the key areas of challenge will be. And I think there are 4. The first and most fundamental is that the UK government and Donald Trump's values are so fundamentally opposed. Climate change is probably the most obvious example, but he's already left the Paris Climate Agreement, or will do. It will take a little time to actually go through, but that's one of the top priorities for Keir Starmer and this government. That puts the UK in a very uncomfortable position. If you think about COP coming up, COP30 is a big event this year, one of the major COPs. And actually we will really struggle to defend the West and our allies on the world stage when Donald Trump probably won't even turn up to COP, and the US certainly won't be making any big commitments. There are others too, so the World Health Organization, again, he's left that or will be in due course, again, will take a while. But actually that's kind of flown under the radar because everyone knew it was going to happen, but microbial resistance will kill us all before climate change. So that's also probably just as scary. So the values piece, I think, will put us in a very difficult position. The second is around our security priorities. Fundamentally, the United States, and this is a Trump point, but also, Biden thought it too, and is understandable in the United States, where the Indo-Pacific is an increasingly important security arena and Europe less so for the United States, and the reverse is true for the UK. So we fundamentally are opposed in where our priorities and our focuses are. When it comes to Ukraine, we are now thinking about a 6-month deal for Ukraine, because there's, unlike in the Middle East, there isn't a deal already on the table, so he's starting from scratch, so it will take some time. But that deal fundamentally will be about what makes sense for the United States and not what makes sense for Ukraine. I wish that wasn't the case, but I fundamentally think it is. And that puts us in a very difficult position, because what if, Trump and Putin agree a deal that fundamentally we disagree with? I mean, there's not a huge amount we can do. Europe can't and won't maintain security support without the United States for a particularly long time. It won't have the capacity to. So we will have a difficult conversation there. The third is around his commitment to existing partnerships, which is non-existent. Fundamentally, he doesn't care that we kind of get along and we have allies. That's not that important to him. He's much more fond of, big personalities, autocrats, etc., where he can do a deal with. Existing relationships, not that important. And the fourth is that Trump has come back with a vengeance. He feels like he was wronged before, and he's kind of proved himself, and he's come back. So a lot of this stuff will be personal. He's surrounded by loyalists now. And when it's personal, it gets more vindictive. I think we're seeing that, conversations today about whether he would reject Mandelson as a UK ambassador to the United States. That would be, him from the start stamping his intention, encouraging his allies to fall in line. He's feeling strong, he's feeling powerful. That might not last long, but for now, at the very least, he's more dangerous than ever. So I think those are kind of the key challenges that we have to grapple with. Ultimately then, I think the United States will be a less reliable partner and ally over the next few years. The world will reshape around it. We will focus towards Europe. We will do the best that we can. But I do think long term, the relationship will endure. We just kind of have to get through the next few years. And we have to think about what we can leverage. We've touched on the royal family, Scotland, etc., which provide kind of a superficial thing, which is better than nothing. There's also the deeper stuff, so Kim touched on security relationship being incredibly important, leveraging that given he's so focused on European security. So we do have assets by which we can, make relationships more constructive, but it will be difficult. And yeah, I'd love to end on a positive note, but I don't have one yet. So hopefully we'll get one in the discussion.
I'd like to ask you all to kind of reflect on Trump's rhetoric, because I think most of us are left kind of reeling, wondering, is he going to invade, Panama? Is he going to take Greenland off the Danish? They're, in Scandinavia, everybody's very, very preoccupied by this. Is he going to invade Canada? If you look in the New York Times today, there are lots of articles going through what would the policy implications actually be of some of the things he's claiming. And so if he goes for blanket tariffs, for instance, the New York Times is convinced that the cost of that will be borne by US importers. So it's not actually true that, he'll be punishing all of us foreigners to quite the degree that he thinks. So I wonder what you all think about the politics of the kind of rhetorical performance. Is he saying these things because he wants something lesser? Is it sort of gas and air? Is it all sizzle and no steak? Or should we really believe that he means what he says? Yeah.
The big difference between Trump in this term and his first term is when he won in 2016, he basically didn't know anyone. I mean, the first time he'd run for any office, any public office in his life, and he decided quite late to join the race. No one thought he had a chance, and that meant that there were 16 candidates. They thought it was an extremely strong Republican field, and all of the cream of strategists and pollsters and advisors had been taken by other candidates, notably Jeb Bush, who was the front runner right at the start. And Trump collected a group of fringe figures, some of whom were quite extreme, like Steve Bannon, others whom were just unknown, like Kellyanne Conway. And they won. And he got into the White House, and he basically didn't know who he wanted. There are 1,200 jobs that change when the Republicans take over from the Democrats, or vice versa. And he knew about 20 people in politics. And so he turned to the Republican Party and said, who do you advise me to? And he gave him a long list of names. And he appointed a lot of them. And he appointed people like retired General Jim Mattis as Defense Secretary. He appointed the head of Exxon, Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State, and so on. And they became known as the adults in the room because some of these figures, Reince Priebus was his first chief of staff, basically spent the time they worked for him trying to stop him doing things. And they really did actually restrain him a lot. Some of them lasted, like Reince Priebus, about 6 months. Some of them lasted a couple of years, like Jim Mattis. If I'm allowed to keep the microphone a little bit on, I'll tell you a story. Gary Cohn, who was Goldman Sachs, was Trump's economic advisor. And he's told this story publicly, so I'm not giving him any great secrets. But there was another man in the White House who was a huge fan of tariffs and wanted Trump to put tariffs on lots and lots of countries, especially China. And Gary was a free trader. And so I had lunch with him once. He told me this story, but then it came out in public later, not from me. He had an ally in the outer office who would tip him off if any paper from this guy he thought was a madman was being put on Trump's desk saying, sign on this and we'll have 200% tariffs on China or whatever it was. And so his ally would take the paper out of the in tray and give it to Gary, who would then go and bury it in the deepest cupboard in the White House. Some future archaeologist will go and find this cupboard, this great pile of crazy policy ideas that Gary Cohn managed to stop. Now, the point of this story is the difference this time is Trump has had a team with him, some of whom are retreads from his first White House, like Stephen Miller, who is his deputy chief of staff, some of whom he's met since when he's been in opposition, but they are all cheerleaders and supporters and enablers. So what you have this time is Trump unleashed. None of those so-called adults in the room, whatever you want to call them, who were restraining him, at least for the first 2 years of his second term, are there this time. And you will get unfiltered, unleashed Trump. And you're already seeing it. So this stuff about invading Panama, this stuff about Greenland, all the rest of it, I don't think he necessarily, no one knows whether he means it. There's always this sort of 5% of uncertainty principle with Trump, unpredictability. I think on Greenland, what he wants is he wants American companies to get the licenses to mine all those rare minerals that are supposedly beneath the snow in Greenland. And I think he wants probably to put more American soldiers, American bases there, more listing posts or whatever. I think that's what he wants, and what he is saying is basically a way of putting pressure on the Danish government to basically make some concessions on that. I think on Panama, my guess is he wants free or hugely discounted traffic through the Panama Canal for American commercial and especially naval vessels. And he would probably like an American company rather than the Chinese to own that port at the mouth of the Panama Canal. And this is a way of putting pressure on the Panamanian government to make those concessions to him. So I think these are real ideas in his head, but I think it's about, if you read The Art of the Deal, not something I necessarily recommend to all of you, but if you do, he's always going on about leverage. Do something unexpected and the other side has to react to, and which makes them frightened. It's the madman theory of negotiation. And that's why I think he's done some of this. And there's a lot more potentially to come, by the way. But the problem with, my last point, the problem with Trump is there's always that 5%. Well, supposing people still defy him, what does he do then? Does he carry out his bluff? And I honestly don't believe he's going to invade Greenland, but I couldn't say absolutely 100% you can rule that out.
Evie.
Sorry, Evie.
Yes, very much echo that, where I think that a lot of the stuff is hyperbole, it's rhetoric. So 5% for NATO. I don't think he expects European nations to spend 5% on defence. That would be absurd in terms of practicalities in the next 4 years. Most of them are so far from that. That's not going to happen. But he does want to scare them into a massive increase in defence spending. If we look at China, for example, he was very, very hawkish on China during the election campaign, and yet one of his first things to do was to temporarily suspend the ban on TikTok. And the motivations there were partly domestic. You know, TikTok's very popular in America. It's a good way to get the public on board. Fundamentally, he thought there was a deal to be done, potentially a 50-50% ownership between a US company and ByteDance, and so there were opportunities, I think, he thought there, which I think shows that if there's a deal to be done on China, for example, he might scale back his rhetoric. Similarly, when you talk about Chinese tariffs on China, and more broadly too, one of the big constraints will be the tech bros, the Elon Musks that are around him that are already starting to splinter on a couple of issues, migration being one of them. But for them, you know, huge tariffs with economic implications are very dangerous and they're very unsupportive. So there can be some mitigating forces, though a lot of the people around them are loyalists. I would also add that if anyone hasn't seen, the BBC has produced a feasibility sort of assessor of some of the executive orders that he announced, which was really useful and showed how few of them he can actually do. And I think that's important to remember as well, that he might be talking big, the amount that he actually wants to do is a little bit lower, and the amount that he can actually do physically is a bit lower than that. So that's a reason to be optimistic. But as Kim says, there's always that 5% chance.
I'd like to say that history would help us calm these waters, but what I'm going to do is underline what Kim and Evie has just said with two quick examples. I mentioned Lyndon Baines Johnson in my presentation earlier on. It was, of course, Lyndon Baines Johnson who said to his National Security Advisor on going to the White House, "Why do I have to see the British Prime Minister so early in my term of office? I have no interest in seeing this man, I don't trust him." And his National Security Advisor told him that that's because Winston Churchill made it so. That's a principle at work. LBJ is on the same spectrum as Donald Trump, but far away from him. To give you an example of how offensive a president can be, when the Australian Prime Minister died, Harold Holt, Lyndon Baines Johnson got in touch with Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister, and said, "I'm going to travel to Australia to go to the funeral of Harold Holt, but don't expect me to come to yours." Because Harold Holt sent troops to Vietnam, you didn't. But he had a set of advisors, and here it's important for us to remember, who would in some way neutralize his instinctive reactions. And the way that Kim and Evie have just described, I'm not sure that's true any longer with Donald Trump. It might have been in his first term. So he had Dean Rusk, who's considered to be the most boring Secretary of State since 1945, but there was a great virtue in his boringness, because he reminded the President of the necessities of international affairs. The other president which might be worth remembering, is, of course, George W. Bush, who wasn't instinctively a diplomat. And worse than that, he was influenced by ideologues very close to him, Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, who were on the more extreme edge of the neoconservative spectrum. But what he had was Colin Powell, who acted as a make-weight for these views. And I don't think there's necessarily in Rubio any kind of make-weight. And more importantly, from the Anglo-American perspective, the UK ambassador to Washington at the time had unusual access in the way that Kim did. And more importantly, Tony Blair carried out a role which British prime ministers have since 1950, when Clement Attlee first travelled to Washington to try and scale down Harry S. Truman's decision to announce that he might use the atom bomb against the Chinese in Korea. What Tony Blair did was strengthen the lobbies within the White House and the State Department and the Pentagon, who were acting against the ideologues who were trying to argue that George W. Bush should go even more mad than he did in the early part of 2001. Mad by, not my measure, by international measures. And I think that's a change, really. We don't have that now.
Could I just add one comment on Marco Rubio, who I met when I was there? Marco Rubio is well on the right wing of the Republican Party. He's a hardliner on Russia, which is good. He's a hardliner on China, which is mostly good. His father fled from Castro's Cuba, so he's a hardliner on Cuba as well. He is going to be a moderate in the next Trump administration, because he's well to the left of the new Defence Secretary, Pete Hegseth, whose claim to fame was he's a presenter on Fox News, and well to the left of Tulsi Gabbard, who is the Director for Intelligence. So Marco Rubio is the closest thing we have now to an adult in the room for Donald Trump, and that makes you think.
What do you think the government policy, Starmer's government, what will their policies be now? What will they be hoping to achieve, do you think, Evie? Damage limitation?
Pretty much exactly that. I think we saw Reeves today also was saying, encouraging that Trump wouldn't impose tariffs and feeling very positive about that. And I think you have to live in that kind of hopeful denial in the situation. I think the reality is that the UK will have to work with the United States. It will have to find opportunities to leverage its existing relationship, be they cultural or defence, to put itself in the best position. And then it will also have to work hard to find allies outside of the United States, bridging those relationships, particularly into Europe, finding those leaders now, the challenge being that both Germany, France, very inward-looking with their own elections, etc. at the moment, same with Poland, but finding potential leaders within Europe where we can coalesce around shared values that we want to protect on the world stage. Because I think the biggest risk, and we've seen it with Trump suspending aid for the first 90 days of his time in office, the US will step back from big, important global issues. That creates a massive power vacuum that China and Russia will fill, and that's one of the riskiest things. And so the UK has to work very proactively to very quickly strengthen relations with Europe. Now, there are lots of challenges to that, not least around trade, etc., and that will make that very difficult. But nevertheless, I think the UK's priority will be, how do we keep the relationship with the United States as good as it can be for now, minimize tariffs, minimize risks, and at the same time, refocus towards Europe. And even, China and things as well, where there'll be a lot of pressure from Trump to not move closer to China, but on big issues like climate change, the United States is stepping back. It's even more important than ever that we speak to China about climate change if we want to make progress. So it will be diversifying our allies, I think, will be key.
I agree with all of that. Just 2 points to add. There is a chance, I think, because of the nature of our trading relationship with the US, and because we're just much smaller than the EU, and if he does do anything on tariffs, we might not retaliate, because it might not be our economy to retaliate, that we will escape the worst of the tariffs. But this government's principal objective is to create much stronger economic growth than we have. And if Trump imposes tariffs, even if it's just on China, that will be bad for the global economy. But if they include Mexico and Canada, where the threat has already been made and comes to fruition, I think in a month he's given them to do more in terms of closing down the border or he'll impose tariffs. If he imposes them on the European Union, that will damage European economies, which are already pretty poor growth there. Remember, we do 40% of our trade with Europe. So my point is, if Trump does, even if we get excluded from tariffs, we get let off, if he does them around the rest of the world to any degree, it damages our economy and it will damage our growth. And there's economic institutes around London already done the analysis and demonstrated that. So that's going to be bad for us, really, even if we escape it. Second point is on China. I think there's going to be confrontation with China. Not military confrontation, but economic confrontation. I think there will be tariffs. And the last Trump term, there was an escalating tariff war. Trump imposed a bunch of tariffs that the Chinese retaliated. He raised them and extended them. Chinese retaliated. Went on for about 3 years, and actually, according to The Economist, did huge damage to the American economy. But I think it'll go that way again. And I think he will come to Europe and say, well, you're all saying, you want a very strong relationship with me, and you want to support me, and going to spend more on defence and the rest of it. I want you to take measures against China on trade alongside me, because that will really bring it home to them about doing something wrong. And you'll find the Europeans, starting with the Germans, who do 5 times as much trade with China as we do, will find this very difficult. So he'll come to the European countries and say, as a test of your loyalty to the relationship with the US, what are you going to do to support me on China? And that will be really contentious.
But is it really the case that even a massive world hegemon can survive without allies, James?
Thank you, Amanda. No, hegemons are not given to altruism, generally, but they are in need of allies. You're absolutely right. And nothing that Evie and Kim said, of course, is inaccurate. In fact, it's probably frighteningly accurate. And the best we can hope for is that after this period of escalation and tariff wars and instability in international affairs, the adults in the room that Kim has mentioned have some leverage to encourage the president to think again about the long-term interests of the presidency, his legacy, and the United States of America. Kim wrote an article for Prospect magazine in April of last year, which indicates a number of areas where at least NATO and NATO powers can encourage a Trump presidency to think again. And I'd recommend you all read that.
Well, I think we should draw some hope from the fact that many journalists suggest that Trump would like a Nobel Peace Prize. Well, thank you very much. It remains for me to thank our speakers, Lord Darroch, Evie Aspinall, and James Ellison. And now I'm just going to throw forward to our forthcoming attractions. On Tuesday, the 4th of February, we'll be welcoming Baroness Sayeeda Warsi to Queen Mary to address Islam and Islamophobia in modern Britain and to discuss her book, Muslims Don't Matter, The Anatomy of a Prejudice. You can book your place using the QR code on the screen, or you can sign up through our website. You can also join our mailing list to receive details about upcoming events and our latest news and publications. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for coming.